understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
Got to say I ain't gonna play Sun City. Nah, I ain't gonna play Sun City.
Well, that was John. Do you know what I did last night? I played Sun City.
I'm going to play Sun City.
I did an event last night in Sun City, which is about 2 hours north of Johannesburg, the place we should never play. And of course, now that apartheid is over, you can play wherever you want. But I am down in South Africa on a book tour, John. On a book tour.
Yeah.
And
did you pack out Sun City though, Mac?
We did 800 in Sun City, Johnny boy.
Wow.
800 in Sun City.
That's brilliant.
And for our small but not unimportant South African audience, there's another book launch on Tuesday, actually tonight as this podcast goes out, at 6 o'clock at the Gibbs Business School in Melville in Johannesburg. So there you go,
Fancy.
John. I am in South Africa, and then I'm going to the Franschoek Literary Festival, which is a big book festival here in the other side of South Africa, which is close to Cape Town. And
wine country.
Exactly, John. Exactly.
Lovely.
And we will do a podcast from there. In fact, John, I think what we're going to do is this is going to be the first of two podcasts we're going to do from South Africa. The first one is going to just be a few initial thoughts and ideas, impressions of South Africa. And the second pod, which will come out on Thursday, is going to be about what being in a big country like this, a middling power like this. When I say middling power, it is by far and away the biggest economy in Africa, the most important country in Africa, a member of the BRICS, as we know, a member of the G20. The idea being, what does being in a place like this tell you about how the world is changing, how Russia is still involved very much down here, how China is still involved very much down here, the perceptions of the United States, the perceptions of the European Union. The idea, just give you a quick figure, in the year of our Lord 2100, so, the end of the century, 6 out of every 10 babies in the world will be African. The entire global population is shifting towards Africa. So it gives you a sense of how much is in play here. Now, of course, the society is a little bit all over the shop here. But, one thing is fascinating is that the South Africans managed to transition from apartheid without a civil war. That in and of itself is an amazing thing, right?
But the difference in populations was so enormous that, it wouldn't last that long.
It wouldn't have lasted long. But my point is that whatever you think about the ANC, and they have run things pretty badly since they got into power. Yeah. But they were trying to do what the previous government never did, which was educate black people, have black people move into not just the professions, but actually be allowed to be on the street after dark. I mean, we're talking about phenomenal things. But I mean, what really interests me, John, in Cape Town, for example, is what you see on the street in Cape Town. There are Indonesians, there are Malays, there are Dutch-speaking white people, there are English-speaking white people, there are French Huguenots, there are, of course, what they call Cape Coloreds, which are a mixed race here. And I went on a tour the other day, and a little walking tour of Cape Town, and the guy was telling me about what they used to have was the pencil test, which was that if you were half white, half black, or some sort of mix, that they would, during the apartheid regime, they'd put a pencil in your head to tell you what race you were. And if the pencil stuck in your hair, you were black. And if the pencil didn't stick in your hair because your hair was actually straight, well, then you were some aspect of colored, right? And then you've got Indian Muslims here, you've got Indian Hindus here. I mean, mad. And the Apartheid Museum is so well worth going to just to underscore the madness of that regime. But in Cape Town, literally, it is the United Colours of Benetton. You have almost every race, every creed, every colour. And again, they appear to be getting on reasonably well. I'm not saying very, very well, but reasonably well. The crime rates you hear about all the time are obviously a fact, but they don't tend necessarily, and this is what I've seen, you don't see them in the cities like, Joburg, everyone says is incredibly violent. I've been there 7 or 8 times. I've never seen anything.
But would you walk around Joburg?
You wouldn't walk around at night.
Yeah, well, see, that's kind of the telltale,
you wouldn't walk
isn't
around
it?
at night because everybody says to you not to walk around at night, if you know what I mean. So there is a certain amount of self-fulfilling prophecy about this. If everyone says don't walk around at night, you don't walk around at night. If everybody else is not walking around at night, the streets are empty, and it reinforces that sense of violence and crime. But what I want to step back and say, when you are here, there is a sense, and it's a strange sense, that things could have gone so much worse than they have done. As a white minority basically gives up power, it could have been much, much worse. And it seems to be, they're getting on. And very interestingly, I asked somebody last night, what's the best indicator of that? And they said the rugby team. They said the rugby team has become the Rainbow Nation.
Yes.
It is the one area where Black players have not only come on, but have been encouraged to come on. The South African Rugby Federation has gone into the townships. There's been an active soliciting of Black talent. And they were talking about Rassie Erasmus, who used to train Munster, who is not the most diplomatic man in the world. And they were saying he has been singularly very, very impressive and leading the charge for multiculturalism in rugby. So they said, if you want to see a success, it is the Springboks, which I thought was quite interesting until I told them that's when they used to beat us, but now they can't beat us. There you go.
Yeah, and that's quite a turnaround because it was rugby that was the focus for the anti-apartheid movement back in the 80s. Remember when, particularly when Ireland and the Lions and all those went on tour in South Africa, and there was massive protests, I remember, which is not the case anymore, obviously. But
no, it's not the case. And I mean, the rugby supporting thing is quite interesting as far as I can make out. I've always been intrigued. I don't know if you've ever met an Afrikaner or a bunch of Afrikaners. I have on many occasions. I've been down here a huge amount of time, and they have these things called braais, which are the kind of barbecues they have outside. And they have the backies, the backup trucks, right? They all have these sort of Toyota Land Cruisers because they live out in the middle of the... They're incredibly macho at one level, except for one thing I've noticed about Afrikaners, John. They really, really love tight khaki shorts. The bigger the Afrikaner, exactly, they're almost like hot pants, right? The bigger the Afrikaner, the tighter the hot pants, right? And once you see it, you can't get it out of your head. It's like a cross between Village People and the Vortrekkers, It's a weird look.
Packing guns as well in those tight hot pants.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. But we're going to talk about them in a minute with Simon Kuper, because the big news down here this week has been that Donald Trump has decided that the Afrikaners, in particular, not just white South Africans, but particularly the Dutch-speaking Afrikaners, who are the original sort of settler tribe here, that they are the most oppressed people ever, and they are refugees. Even though I'll give you a statistic of the entire population here, 6% are white, yet the whites own 47% of all the land. That's how oppressed they are. We'll talk about that in a second. But one other thing I want to talk to you about is when you're down here, so you see all those various different creeds and colors in Cape Town, and you think, well, why is this? And what it is that Cape Town is the ultimate trading maritime city. And every single empire that came in, the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British, changed the city, and they brought with them, and this is the incredible things, people willingly and unwillingly to actually do work for them. So what you see is that it's always been the case historically that empires are much more multi-ethnic than nation states, because the nation state is one sort of, it's our land and it's not their land. And so because South Africa has been colonized by various empires, what you've seen is this very strange demographic legacy of the empire. And what you actually see if you sit back and you look at it from an economic perspective is that the huge economic super cycles that we speak about, whether they're empires, whether they're ideologies, whether they're regimes, leave in their wake people. This is the interesting thing. And it's the people that end up living in the place. So obviously the narrative here is black versus white, which is actually, of course, what it should be, African versus European in the main. But once you get down to Cape Town, you realize that, well, it wasn't just Africans and Europeans. There were Malays, Indonesians, people from Madagascar. And then there's an amazing, I was on this walking tour and I went by a monument and it showed you the names of slaves. So slaves arrived from all over the Dutch Empire and the British Empire. And because they had no surnames, the best way to actually dehumanize a man or a woman is to take away their name, which is exactly what happened in the United States. The Africans' names were taken away. They were given slave names. Exactly the same thing happened here. But because there were so many slaves arriving at so many different times, right, either from internally from Africa or from all around Asia.
Yeah, from the East,
I've got indentured servants, indentured slaves from India, from Pakistan, from all these places, right? They gave people names which accorded with the month they arrive, which is why there are loads and loads of people in South Africa called December, the surname, or January, and April, and June.
No
and
way,
I never
really?
thought about that at all. Yeah.
Wow.
It's a fascinating thing. But the other aspect that came to me, John, was when you're in Cape Town, right in the very center of what they call the CBD, the commercial business district, there is a slab of the Berlin Wall. And I thought, this is a really bizarre thing to have right in the middle of. So I asked somebody about it and they said, look, it was very simple. It was the Berlin Wall was the moment where South Africa changed. And this is interesting because you know the way I always think that ideas travel like viruses from one society to another. And sometimes big events that happen in one society are actually the tail end of events that happened in another society. And that's, of course, what a lot of podcasts have been about in the last few months is MAGA a movement that is going to actually infect the rest of the world, etc. So the idea was the following, was that 40 years after the Second World War, so the start of apartheid is in the 1940s, with Verwoerd and his notion of separating the races. But one of the reasons that it was tolerated and stayed in place was that the white South African regime was regarded as anti-communist. And therefore, the West looked away and turned a blind eye at the appalling reality of apartheid because the white South Africans were basically the Western guys down in Africa.
Yeah.
So they would do anything to support the Western guys down in Africa. So we wouldn't mind what they were doing in Soweto. We wouldn't mind what they're doing in Sharpeville. We wouldn't mind what they were doing to the black people as long as communism was a threat. Then the minute communism stops being a threat, when the Berlin Wall falls and the Kremlin runs out of money and ideology, suddenly the ANC, who were the Kremlin's guys down here, who were basically aligned to the communist ideology, but also the liberation ideology, they therefore become friends, not enemies, or at least not as bad enemies. And many people down here believe that basically de Klerk wasn't this fantastic new brain Afrikaner who said we have to change, but that actually got a tap on the shoulder from Washington that said, now, man, the game is up. Because communism was gone, and the Americans basically swapped communism with another liberation ideology that they kind of had to put together, which they called the American consensus, the Washington consensus, which is what has been driving the society for the last 30 years. But that idea, which I find fascinating, that apartheid didn't crumble in South Africa. Because if you listen to a lot of Irish people, they say, oh, well, it's because of sanctions and anti-apartheid movement.
But
and all
there
that
was the
good stuff.
growing anti-apartheid feeling and movement throughout the world, not just Ireland and the Duns workers
everywhere,
who were great.
everywhere.
But everywhere. So it was becoming untenable as well, though, for governments.
But the geopolitical harsh reality is that had it not been for the eclipse of the Soviet Union, the ANC wouldn't have been so toxic for the Americans, and the white Afrikaner government wouldn't have been tolerated. And so the coincidence of facts where the Berlin Wall comes down, Mandela gets released, de Klerk looks for an exit strategy for the Afrikaners, the white South Africans, culminating in the first election in 94, all of which is part of the same background noise. And that, I think, is interesting. And it's acknowledged in Cape Town by this slab of the Berlin Wall that most people just ignore.
Yes,
but in actual fact, it is a very pointed link between the local and the cosmopolitan. So the national politics and local events and what's going on in the rest of the world. And the next podcast I'm going to do from down here, John, is going to look at that to say, what does this part of the world tell you about what is happening in the rest of the world? And the reason is we are so inundated with Trumpism and America and all this sort of thing that what we're not picking up is the gradual and progressive role of China still in this area, the gradual and enduring friendship between the ANC and the Soviet Union as reconstituted under Putin's Russia, and the gradual change in the global economy where the United States doesn't have all the cards. And not only doesn't it have not all the cards, but when you look at a country like this, of course, the South Africans are saying, which way do we jump? Or do we have to jump at all? Do we have to go into the Chinese camp or the American camp? Or is there a third way?
Which would be BRICS, maybe.
Or some idea where you don't necessarily have to have multilateralism. You don't have to have one big agreement. You can have 10 small agreements between smaller countries. And I think it's a fascinating way to look at the world. And again, it's something that's crystallized down here for me. But, John, what I want to focus on right now is the news from America that the only refugees who are worthy of American citizenship are not Colombians, are not Mexicans, are not Venezuelans, are not people from sub-Saharan impoverished Africa, but are actually wealthy white South Africans, right? And that is the news all over the newspapers down here, that Trump has opened his doors to wealthy white South Africans. Question is why?
Is that welcome down there in South Africa? Are they going, rubbing their hands, going, brilliant, we can move to America? Or are they going, what? What's going on?
What? No, what? Like, so I talked to an Afrikaans guy last night. He said, like, this is bonkers. This is completely ridiculous. But it's happening. So, like all these things, I want to get under the hood and see, why is this happening? And there is a fascinating backstory, and we're going to hear it now. So let's go to Simon Kuper of the FT, who has the backstory as to why Donald Trump has become the savior of the Afrikaner race, who don't look like they want to be saved from anything and seem to be, in general, quite happy down here. Now, one of the more bizarre episodes down here in South Africa was the headline yesterday, came from the New York Times, but it's obviously something that's been brewing here for a long, long time, or at least a number of months, which is the notion that Donald Trump has decided that of all the refugees that merit a place in American societies, of all the displaced people, of all the people who have been harangued, harassed, besmirched, treated unfairly, the people who have been treated most unfairly in his eyes are white South Africans specifically, but not entirely limited to the Dutch-speaking South Africans who are descendants of the Dutch settlers who are known as Afrikaners. Now, this might come as a surprise to people. It certainly was a surprise to a lot of the white South Africans I spoke to in the last couple of days. They said they largely feel that this is an invention, but it's an invention of a certain mindset which is associated with South Africa and exists deep within the MAGA movement, or maybe not in the MAGA movement, but in the advisors of and the people of the ear of the President Donald Trump. So I wanted to explore this idea, and I can think of no better man to explore this with than the FT's Simon Kuper, because Simon wrote a piece about this about 8 or 9 months ago, a long time before it became apparent. Simon, how are you?
Very good. Lovely to speak to you, David.
Now, Simon, just your roots, or your familial roots, are in South Africa.
Yes, both my parents were born and raised in Johannesburg, left 60 years ago, never went back, but I still have what seems like a million relatives there, have been back all my life.
Now, explain to me this idea. So last night, as white South African guys said, look, this is all about people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk. You know, they are very, very, very significant parts of the MAGA conversation, and they have a view of South Africa, of white South Africa. You wrote about this, I think it was last July. I thought the article was fascinating. I put it down, and it's only this morning that it makes complete sense to me.
Yeah, so a surprising amount of the Silicon Valley support for Trump is really people who came from South Africa, most famously Musk, who lived there until he was 17 before he got out to his, homeland of Canada, where his mother had come from. Peter Thiel lived in South Africa and Namibia as a child when his German father was trying to help South Africa get the nuclear bomb. He was involved in uranium mining. David Sachs, who is the crypto czar of the Trump administration, left South Africa aged 5, okay, but like me would have had many family connections, be very familiar with what's going on in the country, like me, made many return visits. There's a couple of other figures not discussed. The QAnon conspiracy seems to have been originated by a Johannesburg software developer called Paul Ferber. So these teams of kind of technical forensic analysis have traced the original post to Paul Ferber. He doesn't confirm this, but it seems very likely. And then there's also the publisher of the LA Times, who's a Chinese South African called Patrick Soon-Chong, who, much like Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post, has taken the LA Times, which was historically liberal, pro-democratic, and stopped them supporting Kamala Harris last year and has stopped them criticizing Trump since. So the role of this tiny group of people in Trumpism is quite surprising. And yes, they have turned Trump's attention to South Africa. So what does South Africa mean in the Trump universe? It means a country that was run by whites and was then taken over by blacks. And of course, this is an underlying United States nightmare, this idea that one day the suppressed black people of the US might rise up and take over. Of course, it's never going to happen, but South Africa is that nightmare fulfilled in their eyes. Of course, South Africa was a dysfunctional country during apartheid and is a dysfunctional country now. So I don't think it's become more dysfunctional necessarily, but in their eyes, that's the nightmare. Musk especially is very obsessed by South Africa and the threat to whites, as his grandfather was. We can come on to his grandfather, who moved to South Africa because it was the last officially white supremacist nation at the time.
So let's just look at the connection there, because I'm fascinated by, and I've always been fascinated by how small coterie of individuals can actually insert themselves into a massive movement and change things profoundly. Because I don't think anybody would have suggested 2 or 3 years ago that white South Africans would have merited the position of the most oppressed people ever. But Trump believes this. This you think is coming from Thiel and Musk? Do you think so?
I mean, it very much appeals to Trump because the Trump ideology is white victimhood. Everyone is against white people, black people are unfairly favored, all this nonsense. And underlying that, because the United States is a country with this history of violence that is directed at suppressing black people and keeping them under control, much as South Africa was, the fear is that one day this organization of violence will cease to work and the black people will take over, and then it will be a bloodbath. See, I remember right ahead of the end of apartheid, the first free elections of 1994, that was the very widespread white dystopia that Nelson Mandela is going to be elected and then they're going to come and kill the whites in their beds. And that sort of killing the whites in their beds is an underlying negative fantasy of Trumpism. So it very much appeals to him. And so Trump, egged on by Musk, has reached out to the Afrikaners, who weren't refugees at all, very largely still living in South Africa, and who farm a very large portion of the land in South Africa, and said, oh, well, you're refugees and you should come and live in the United States. Of course, this is appealing to a few of them. Most of those have already gone, like Roelof Botha is a massive venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, grandson of the last apartheid foreign minister. But Afrikaner, the clue is in the name. These are people, as you say, largely of Dutch descent, also some French Huguenots and Germans mixed in, who came to South Africa and over time came to see themselves as an African tribe, hence Afrikaner. They want to be where they are. The whole point of being an Afrikaner is you're an Afrikaner in Africa. They're not looking to be resettled. So of all the refugees in the world, Trump has landed upon this group of people who aren't refugees.
And who don't want to leave. I mean, this is one of the whole things. The Afrikaner said, well, we are a white tribe in Africa at this stage, and we're not going anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, the ones who wanted to leave are very largely left already over the last 30 or 40 years to more dynamic economies, also white-run countries like Australia, United States, Britain, a few in Holland. But the ones who've stayed, they feel that and I think they're right, they feel that they're as African as any black South African, Zulu or Xhosa or Ndebele.
Now let's look at, you said we come back to in a second, Elon Musk's dad, Elon Musk's family, because Musk looms large in everything that Trump does, and vice versa at this stage. They're kind of tied at the hip, the pair of them, either to succeed or fail together. But explain to me a little bit about Musk's background and what would actually be driving his obsession with white supremacy, with the nation of whites being, let's say, usurped, etc.
I mean, Musk has a lot of dystopian fantasies. Obviously, the Earth is going to be destroyed, so we need to settle on Mars. The United States can go bankrupt. If we don't all have more children, we're going to die out. And one of the dystopias, I think, is that is this race war, the South African and also Trumpian vision of a race war where the black people win. Now, nobody is their grandfather, but it's striking how similar Musk's views are to those of his grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, who was this Canadian nutcase. He was an aviator, chiropractor, and in the 40s, after supporting Nazism for a while, which didn't end well, he decides that South Africa is the future, and he moves his family there and, makes various statements about how black people are obviously not able to run their own affairs. This is moving on from the anti-Semitism, although some of the anti-Semitism stays. And so the grandfather is a hero within the Musk family, this kind of, he's the patriarch figure. And it's interesting. He also believed, he was a technocrat, so he also believed that sort of people with technological training should run affairs and not stupid politicians and so on, which again is very familiar. So I think there is some degree of continuity. And obviously, Trump had zero interest in South Africa, but in American politics,
This is an entirely new idea. Trump's sort of fascination with white South Africans.
But as an Irishman, you'll know that in American politics, countries like Ireland, Israel, South Africa are not real places. They're just projections of the fantasy of your ethnic group. So for Irish Americans, Ireland stands for we are wonderful people. And Ireland must be a wonderful place because we are wonderful people, and the real existing Ireland is not really such an issue. But we have a fantasy of Ireland, we have a fantasy of Israel, now we have a fantasy of South Africa, which is it was run by good white people, now by bad black people.
Can I also ask you about, just to get deeper into the South African, because the podcast is coming from South Africa, and I want to focus on South Africa, but there is another issue, which is the Ireland, South Africa versus Israel story, which we're talking about as well with the International Court of Justice, the fact that Ireland and South Africa have been very, very pro-Palestinian, very, very anti-Israeli, very, very anti the IDF, etc. So I want to park that. I'll come back to it in a second, because that was mentioned to me as well in the conversation last night. But I want to talk to you about this idea that if you were brought up in South Africa, or if your parents were brought up or were mature adults and workers during the apartheid age, then that government disappears, or at least that government is handed over to the ANC. There's another sort of anti-government vibe in the MAGA libertarian movement, which may well have its roots down here.
Yeah, so in South Africa, the state was always awful. What is a state for? It's to ensure the well-being, the prosperity, the health, the safety of the population. And the South African state never did that for most people. Under apartheid, it did that for the 10% of the population who were whites, who lived very well, who got all the blessings of the land. I mean, I used to come as a child from Holland or England when we were living, and I'd visit my grandparents, and there was a swimming pool, and there was a maid serving us chocolate cake. And we had everything. And then you saw, well, the maid lives in the garage. She lives in these 2 rooms behind the garage with her grandchildren because her children are dead. And the grandchildren are wearing our old underpants that we gave them. And so it's just a very bizarre and terrible society to see. So the whites lived off the face of the land. 90% of the population are suppressed. They have nothing. And then the African National Congress takes over, has run the country since 1994 and has run it very badly. So education is still terrible. The vast majority of black people are still poor. It's a dangerous country. You can't go out safely at night, as you'll know, staying in Rosebank. And so it's a country where government always sucked. Whereas we as Europeans, I think largely, I grew up in countries where there was some trust in government. The government does good things. The government gives you healthcare. The government gives you decent schooling. South Africans never felt that. So when people like Musk leave South Africa, it's with this idea the state is the terrible thing that really is just dreadful and better off without it. So the libertarianism of Silicon Valley fits quite nicely onto their upbringing.
Now, let's just talk briefly about what's next. Let's say Trump decides that, the Afrikaners are indeed this oppressed race. And let's say 5,000 of them leave, which is a hell of a lot of people to leave any place. But let's say that that's happened, right? They arrive in America, they realize in actual fact America is not the land of milk and honey. In fact, they'll arrive and their standard of living will plummet yet further. But do you think that this sort of South African legacy, the hangover of apartheid, which lives between the ears of certain people like Musk and Thiel, and I want to talk about Thiel in a second, do you think it's playing out in the MAGA movement in the sense that they're seeing their fears and their aspirations are their fears are South Africa in 1994, their aspirations are South Africa in 1974?
Yeah, I think that's very well put. The aspiration is a big house with a pool and black servants. And so in the US, there's this thing of plantation weddings where a white couple will get married on an old slave plantation, in the beautiful house with the lovely veranda and with servants. So going around the American South in the past, I think this is exactly South Africa. And they also inspired each other. So yes, there is this idea we can go back to when white was white and black was black. I think that is a big part of the fantasy.
And Peter Thiel is German, but explain to me how he ends up down here, what his dad was doing down here, and what he seems to have taken away.
So Peter Thiel, his father is a German engineer in mining, and South Africa is trying to develop the nuclear bomb because South Africa sees itself as, the kind of bulwark of white civilization, that's very important, against communism. And the African National Congress is then banned, represents communism, and everyone's a communist, so we need the nuclear bomb. And so his father goes to work in mines, or he's a top engineer in mines in South Africa and Namibia. And in these mines, you have these black workers who have these absolutely terrible lives with virtually no healthcare, and it's not that far off from they're serfs essentially. And then you have white managers like the Thiels who have this fantastic healthcare and the country club with lots of pools, and they have servants. And so you leave that and you come to the United States, and what you've absorbed as a child can be, well, we're rich because we're smarter. And these people are serfs because they're not very smart. And apartheid also took care to educate black people as badly as possible. And also, not many of them couldn't speak English, which is the working language in these places, or spoke it very poorly. So you can come away thinking, well, it's natural that we're on top and they're at the bottom. That's just meritocracy. And it's very similar in the United States, where meritocracy is largely fake. It largely depends on how you were raised and how much money you were raised with, how far up the pole you can climb. And so you think, well, all these people with their DEI projects or affirmative action to help black people, well, that's flying in the face of nature because, we white men in Silicon Valley, we got here not because we're white men, but because we're smarter than everyone else. And so he writes this book with David Sachs in 1995 when there are these two very overconfident white men just out of Stanford saying, well, all this multiculturalism is rubbish and there is no racism in our generation. That's all over. It's all about meritocracy. So the Trumpian idea of meritocracy is if meritocracy works, then the cleverest people, obviously white men, so they will end up on top. And any attempt to change that means you're messing with meritocracy, which is, as we know, a deeply flawed idea, but is a Thielian idea too.
Yeah, a copy of the Fountainhead for every man who enters this room. Can I just ask you finally about the Israel issue? So one of the issues that has obviously animated Trump is South Africa's leading the charge in taking Israel to the International Criminal Court. And to what extent do you think South Africa's pro-Palestinian stance is informing Trump and it's helping to create a worldview that, South Africa is a corrupt country, the whites are being attacked, and now look at what they're saying about Israel?
Yeah, so Trump was very much 110% supporter of Israel. And I think that might now be ending. I think Trump is peeling off Israel for various reasons. And so this could be quite a turnaround coming. But until now, yes, for Trumpians, one of South Africa's sins was that it presents this affidavit accusing Israel of, I think, genocide to is it the International Criminal Court or the
International Criminal Court? The International Criminal Court.
Which are both in The Hague and linked organizations.
They also have an Irish barrister prosecuting the case, which puts us in the same... Well, also the Irish government is very, very much supportive of the South Africans.
So there was this historical connection between the African National Congress and the Palestinians, although the ANC was always telling Palestinians quite patronizingly, oh, you have to make peace with Israel the way we made peace with the whites, etc., but we're on your side. I think that when a big country had to be found to present the case against Israel, it couldn't be a Muslim country because then it would look like, oh, well, Muslims are against Israel. That doesn't make an impact. South Africa is vast majority Christian country with a small Muslim population, even smaller Jewish population. So you have this, it was important to have a Christian majority country presenting this case, made it look more impartial, representative of the global South. Now, the South African Justice Department is so incompetent that I don't think it's feasible they could have written that affidavit. I think it was written by an NGO, which is absolutely fine. I don't think that invalidates the affidavits at all, but it is how South Africa came to be the country that presented this case. When they did, before Trump, they had no idea that it might come back and bite them in the leg. But now that Trump, I think, is shifting position on Israel, I don't think that's going to be an issue between him and South Africa anymore.
Simon, fascinating, trying to draw together all these various different strands, but extraordinary when you think that Trump has decided now that this crowd here are refugees, and then you realize where that impulse comes from. Again, Simon, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, David.
South Africa is a country I actually don't know. I've never been there, but it sounds fascinating, but it sounds really bizarre. It's like a bizarre kind of politically and socially and the whole lot. But let me ask you a question, Mac. For all of that, South Africa is very wealthy in terms of natural resources and minerals, but also human capital as well. Why is the economy performing so poorly?
No, it's a very, very fair question. I mean, of course, what Simon was talking about there is South Africa being a pawn in a much bigger game, right?
Yeah.
And that's what strikes you as, so the bigger game for MAGA is to, in a way, rerun or run their apocalyptic visions of what might happen in the United States through the lens of South Africa, and then use some discontented Afrikaners as the bait in a bigger story.
Yeah.
But the idea of the country being used is something that, so if you think about the history of all of Africa, the history of certainly colonialism is the history of the local people being used by other people. And I think that there's no argument that South Africa was the worst because it enshrined this in the constitution under the Verwoerd apartheid years. Then Mandela comes in, and Mandela, you can see, is trying to keep the whole thing together in many, many ways. There are many different tribes here. There are, I think, 11 official languages and 27 unofficial languages.
Yeah.
There are within the Africans, as you could imagine, within the Africans here, there are people are as different as Greeks and Germans, as Germans to Swedes, as Swedes to Paddies, as Paddies to Italians, etc., etc. So you've got a continental mix of languages, creeds, tribes, loyalties. So just keeping the whole thing together in and of itself is an amazing achievement. But to get back to the economy, what they have, John, is huge amounts of humans. But that's not necessarily human capital, because what you need those people to be doing is moving what they say is up the value chain, right? And up the value chain means you're moving from very basic jobs to less basic jobs. Now, if you think about what Simon Kuper was saying, the vast majority of Black people under the apartheid regime were maids and gardeners. That's what they actually did, right? So the question is, how do you get their children to move into managerial positions, skilled artisans positions, manufacturing skilled positions, et cetera, et cetera? Now, the reason I mentioned the Washington Consensus at the top was what the ANC replaced apartheid with was they joined the multilateral world community, the global community.
Yeah.
And the idea was that the world would see South Africa and the rest of Africa, but particularly South Africa, as a phenomenal opportunity for growth, that capital would come in from outside, would fuse with African labor, which was incredibly cheap, and they would make middle income products to sell to the rich world.
Yeah.
That was the model.
A bit like India and China, their manufacturing.
Yeah. But I think the South Africans were unlucky that they emerged around the same time as China. And the Chinese are not only eating the Africans' lunch, they're eating everyone's lunch, right?
Yeah.
So what has happened in South Africa is the economy remains largely jaundiced towards mineral extraction and services. And the bit in the middle you need for growth, for dynamism, is manufacturing. So if you go back in development models, every single country that has grown quickly and permanently has had a manufacturing story that it has told. So the first industrial revolution was Britain in the 18th century, Germany in the 19th century, and by Germany, I mean Germany and continental Europe in the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah.
America at the end of the 19th century and all the way into the first half of the 20th century. These were manufacturing countries. Then Japan after the Second World War, a manufacturing exporter. This drags up the South Koreas of this world. Then in the last 40 years, China is a manufacturing country.
Yeah.
And the manufacturing it's not doing, it's exporting to the Vietnams of this world. Now you see India is becoming a manufacturing country. So what does that tell you? It tells you countries need to go through manufacturing development stages. Now, why is this important? It is because manufacturing is the one area of production that you can actually have productivity gains. By that I mean, manufacturing is where you introduce technology like a machine that can actually make people unbelievably productive, an individual. So for example, take the great thing of services, you can't do this. A great example of that is only one hairdresser can cut one head of hair at one time.
Yes.
Okay, you don't have 20 shears going across
Yeah,
a
yeah,
manufacturing line of heads going in, right? So just keep that image in your head that it's impossible to achieve the same returns to scale in services as it is in manufacturing, particularly basic services.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
where the Africans are stuck, and I say this for all of Africa, but particularly South Africa, is they haven't broken into the basic manufacturing game. Now, why is this? I think it's because they were unlucky enough to come into the game at the same time as the Chinese.
Right.
And we know that China has an ability to mobilize its people in pursuit of one objective identified by the Communist Party, which is manufacturing prowess. As a result of that, all the resources of the country have been funneled into achieving this target.
Yeah.
And not only is, as we know, China eating the lunch of middle-income countries, China is eating the lunch of rich countries, which is why we have the trade war with China.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So what you have here then is a very strange situation where, yes, you have resources. Yes, you have the capital base. Yes, you have a legacy of high-end services, and you have, from mining, you have an industrial base, but you don't have the attendant manufacturing industry. And as a result of this, you haven't had the productivity or the innovation or the investment. And all you have therefore is agriculture, tourism, and mining. Mining is an extractive industry.
Yeah.
And as an extractive industry, the gains are always going to go to the owners, who are a tiny minority.
Yes.
Agriculture is agriculture, as we know. And basic tourism is great and fantastic, but you never get rich through tourism.
Yeah. And I suppose the other issue with not just with South Africa, but throughout Africa is the legacy, or certainly the perception, of high-level corruption, which would put off an awful lot of investors.
Well, there's a thing called state capture, which is very important in developing countries. Now, the administration of Jacob Zuma was one of the most corrupt the world has ever seen. And what basically happened was the ANC, under Zuma, big Zulu leader, ANC leader, he basically is giving out money to his mates. So the big telecoms contracts, the big electricity contracts, the big water contracts, all the contracts that had got to do with the state led to something that was called state capture, which is the capture of the state by private, politically favoured lads. There were a pair of brothers called the Gupta brothers, who were largely the bagmen for Zuma. Ramaphosa, the present president, is trying to unravel that. It takes years to get rid of that.
Yeah. But that's what Musk is doing. This is where he learned it. This is what he's doing, getting all the US government contracts.
Well, exactly. So, I mean, a lot of Africans will say, well, don't point the finger at us because this is exactly what you're doing yourselves. But you are right. And again, probably, and we leave it here, the litmus test for South Africa has been the price of the currency, the rand. Because the rand has fallen precipitously for years and years and years. And it's almost like a vicious negative cycle. So what happens is you have capital, which is in South Africa, that wants to be deployed. But that capital in South Africa, there isn't enough capital in South Africa to actually push the economy completely forward. What you get, therefore, is this state capture means that people who own stuff in South Africa know that their stuff is going to be robbed by somebody in the state. So what they do then is they try as best as they can is get the money out. So you have always got these current account problems, right? So the rich white people are trying to get their money out all the time from South Africa. So as they get their money out, the rand falls even further, right? As the rand falls even further, it scares them even more because the value of their investments in South Africa relative to what they might have in Europe or America continues to fall. And therefore you get this vicious cycle where the rand falls, that precipitates more capital outflow. The more capital outflow precipitates the rand fall. Then they go to the IMF and they say, give us a loan to stabilize the currency. That just means they're in debt to foreigners, official foreigners rather than private foreigners.
This is a similar story to Argentina.
And this is exactly where we're going to end here. So the Washington Consensus, which was accepted by Mandela because he was trying to hold the country together more than anything else, has led to the progressive hollowing out of the industrial base here. Now, this is why I think we're at a moment of inflection where lots of people will say, hold on, we tried that for 30 years, didn't really work. Is there plan B? And plan B may well involve not Washington, not the IMF, not America, but China. And that is the next pivot that may well happen in South Africa. And I think that's where we will pick up the podcast on Thursday. Just before you go, new single by Lucy McWilliams, the proud dad here. I know she's probably going to kill me, but there you go. It's called The Greatest Man. Let's play out with this new tune by Lucy McWilliams.